Hello, everyone. Hello, welcome to the SERA ECR podcast, Conversations with Scholars. At this episode, we're having Professor Walter Humes with us. Walter, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. Yes, well, I started my career as a teacher of English, and then I worked in a college of education and several universities. I've been a professor at the universities of Aberdeen, Strathclyde, and West of Scotland. I've been retired for quite a few years, but I'm still doing some work, and I'm very fortunate to have the post of honorary professor at the University of Stirling.
Yes, I think that's how I got to know you, because when I was doing my first year annual progress review, my supervisor, Professor Mark Priestley and Dr. Joe Smith, invited you to be on the examiner board. I'm like, are you sure? Will Walter be interested in my research? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that I remember that meeting, and it's been good to catch up with you since then.
Yes.
So I'm pleased to
Yeah,
be able to contribute to your program.
Thank you. I'm going to start a postdoc soon, so I'll definitely bother you more about this later. But today, I'll hit you with a starter question that we always begin the podcast. So, what fruit or vegetable would you use to describe your research?
Well, I would need to involve more than one vegetable because my example is vegetable soup. And soup, of course, requires a lot of different ingredients.
Yeah.
And I actually make quite a lot of my own soup. And I'm always looking for new recipes and new ideas. And in a sense, that reflects my research because I wouldn't describe myself as a narrow researcher focusing only on education. I draw on ideas taken from a number of disciplines, including history, philosophy, sociology, politics, and different literary styles. I've recently been writing quite a lot based on biographical approaches to research. So my academic work is a kind of vegetable soup.
That's very interesting. And when you talk about vegetable soup, I have this kind of like, it's always quite warm, kind of like when you feel cold, you have this soup and like, yes. And also the soup here, it takes a lot of time to cook as well. Like you need to be patient with this because there have to be loads of vegetable and then shrink into a soup.
And then that too is like research because often it takes much longer than you expected. And some soups are more successful than others. And looking back at on my publications, there are some publications that I'm happier with than others, and some that I would prefer perhaps not to have written at all.
But they are out, though. It's going to be the people who taste it and then feel about this research. But I think the research I was recently I was reading was your collaboration with Mark in curriculum making in Europe about what is curriculum making in Scotland and related with curriculum policy and practice. That's what kind of the soup I have had.
Yes, I found it very productive working with Mark, who is much more knowledgeable about curriculum than I am, but I've appreciated the fact that he's involved me in some of his research projects, and we've written 2 or 3 pieces together, and that's been very helpful.
I think it's again with this research, sometimes when you gradually develop, it's important to have collaborator. Then that's also how you bring in, like for the vegetable soup, bring in new recipes, new ideas. Yes.
Yes, although I do have one cautionary note about collaborating.
Yeah.
I mean, I have collaborated with people over the years, and you always learn something from working with other people. But I've begun to have some reservations about multi-collaborations, and
Yeah.
many academic articles now have about 5 or 6 authors,
Mm.
and that will inevitably involve negotiation about the text.
Yeah.
And my concern is that I think it can often lead to more cautious text because people want to argue to perhaps tone down certain parts,
Yeah.
play up others. And I think that research, not all the time, but some of the time, certainly needs to be a bit provocative and
Mm.
bold.
Yeah.
And if you have too much collaboration and negotiation and
Yeah.
discussion about this word and that phrase, it can lead to a rather timid kind of writing. And I don't think we can put up with too much of that. I think we need
I see.
fairly substantive, bold pieces to
Yeah.
stimulate thinking and debate.
That's very important. Thanks for sharing that. And now we're moving to the SERA 50 questions. As we all know, SERA is going to have 50 years anniversary this year. It's having it now. And I want to have the SERA 50 questions for the SERA people. The first question, and this would be, how did you meet SERA? When did you join SERA? How did it happen? And why did you join SERA?
Well, I was appointed to my first university post at Glasgow in 1976.
76.
Yes. And when I joined, I was, entering territory that I wasn't terribly familiar with. I had just completed a master's degree in education at Glasgow. But my colleagues urged me to go to SERA, to make contact with others, to find out what other research was going on. And so that was how I got into SERA. And I've attended quite a number of conferences over the years, not all of them, but I found it intellectually stimulating experience. Yeah. I've met a lot of very able people whose ideas I have learned from.
Yeah, so you think it's kind of collegiality that brings you to SERA, and to see there are people also doing this research that you want to be more familiar with.
Yes, although I wouldn't claim to be a particularly collegial person. Although I enjoy writing jointly, my natural tendency is to write on my own, and a lot of my publications are single author publications. Yes. But as I said earlier, you always learn from working with other people.
I think so. Another question is, since you have joined SERA in 1976, around that time, till these days, what are the most memorable story or stories that you have had with SERA or with people involved in SERA?
Well, this is a particular episode which most of the people listening to this will be too young to remember. But I published a book in 1986.
1986.
Called The Leadership Class in Scottish Education, which was rather a controversial book in that it challenged many of the assumptions about how educational policy was conducted in Scotland. And it received quite a bit of attention, but it also annoyed quite a few people, particularly senior people in the inspectorate. And SERA organised an event where 3 people who were in a position to comment on my research were asked to make comment on the book. One of them had written a fairly hostile review about the book. But that means you've got to accept sometimes that your work won't get a universally positive response. One of them was an academic, one was a principal of a college of education, and one was a very senior civil servant who had been secretary of the Scottish Education Department. So there were people in a position to know about policy making, and so they proceeded to tell me where I had got things wrong.
Oh.
And I was then given an opportunity to respond, which I did robustly. And there was quite a lot of interest in the exchange, so much so that the Times Educational Supplement, which was the
Yes.
reported on these things, had as its headline the following week, "Blood on the Carpet at SERA Conference,"
Wow.
which suggested that, you know, it was a very lively exchange, but it was an enjoyable exchange. And certainly I subsequently got to know the principal of the College of Education quite well. And he was very kind to me at various points in my career. So we didn't fall out permanently, but that's a sort of highlight of my involvement with SERA.
Yeah, it's kind of like this kind of very, I don't know what's it. I think that blood on the carpet probably captures the kind of like the tension and all these kind of like debates in that field. But when we finish the argument, still should be kind to each other. It's about the argument instead of to the person. I guess that's what I can imagine from what you tell.
So that stands out, but there have been lots of very good meetings. For many years, the conference was held in St Andrews, and we were given rooms in what was then a student residence called Hamilton Hall, and it was right next to the 18th hole of the famous St Andrews golf course. So that, and on one occasion, it may even have been the occasion that I'm referring to, I can't remember precisely, I was given a room overlooking the 18th hole of the golf course, and there was a really big tournament going on. Wow. So I thought at the time I could have sublet it to some photographers who might have wanted to capture some of the play, but I didn't get round to doing that. That student residence, by the way, was subsequently sold by the university. It's now a set of luxury apartments, and the penthouse apartment, I believe, was sold for more than £1 million.
Wow.
It's a superb location.
Superb location, yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah. All these things that I never to see. I can afford that luxury hotel. Sarah will never rent that for me. Yeah. So the third question would be, what would be different if you have not engaged with Sarah? I guess at least as a blood on carpet won't happen, but what would have be different if you have not been engaged with Sarah?
Yes, I think I would have lost a lot of opportunities to make contact with other researchers, some of them working in my own area, others in areas that I knew less about, but you know, I wanted to find out about. So I think it would have been a loss. I think the other aspect of it that's perhaps worth mentioning is that at that time, SERA and the publication Scottish Educational Review were very closely connected. And I actually became editor of Scottish Educational Review in the early 1990s, when it went through a difficult period financially. It's now, of course, published by Brill, and is run quite professionally, and I think it probably was good that that opportunity came up. But a lot of my research, early research particularly, was published in Scottish Educational Review, and I don't think I would have been aware of that had the link between the two not existed. So that would be a loss too, if I hadn't had any involvement with SERA.
Yeah. And the next question about SERA 50 is, what is the difference between today's SERA and the SERA you joined?
I think it's a much bigger organization. I think it's not as narrowly Scottish. There are quite a lot of people from elsewhere in the UK and overseas who come to the SERA conference. There's for years been quite a regular contingent from Iceland, for example.
Yeah, from Nordic, Nordic
yes, and
education research.
More generally, Nordic countries. So I think it's become bigger. I think it's become more professional. I think it has sought to be the Scottish equivalent of BIRA, but there are strong links between SERA and BIRA.
They're having the 50th anniversary, both having 50th anniversary this year.
Yes, I'm actually speaking at the
SERA joint event.
Yes, the joint event with Gary McCulloch, who's representing BIRA. So I think it's probably in a healthier state than it was in the early stages. I've been reading some of the stuff about the early years of SERA in preparation for this event that's coming up. And it was quite modest in scale. There was some uncertainty at the beginning about whether it would survive. One difference I have noticed, however, is that in the early days, there was a very strong attempt to involve teachers, school teachers, in the organization. And there was quite a strong effort, with some success, to involve administrators, people like directors of education, people from the Scottish Education Department. And I think the involvement of administrators is now weaker than it was at that time. And there are various possible explanations for that. People in charge of local authority education and children's services departments are under tremendous pressure for financial and other reasons, so maybe they just don't have the time. There is, however, quite a lot of involvement of teachers in schools, especially those who are studying for an Ed.D. degree, the professional doctorate, and that is very much welcome.
It's quite interesting because when you were talking about it, I was revisiting or kind of like replaying what the sessions I've been attended to. I think there were sessions that I see there are teachers, administrators, like these from Education Scotland. I think they are administrators or kind of like directors related to this. I think they also I would see in my limited experience of SERA conference, they would go to particular sessions. And because now it's getting bigger and bigger, it's that not always you will see them in the same session like me, like as early career researchers who are more interested in educational research and in all the kind of concepts of this. It's good that there are more people. It's just also maybe very important to think about who are we engaging with. So
just one footnote. Over the years, I think there has been variable involvement of inspectors and administrators from what used to be the Scottish Education Department. And sometimes there has been quite a bit of tension between the policymakers and the educational research community. And I think I can understand the two perspectives, because policymakers want clear answers, often difficult questions, whereas researchers are interested in complexity, and they're reluctant to give very clear black and white answers. So I wrote an article, I think about 2016, about the tensions between the research community and the policymaking community. It depends on the personnel, of course. There have been times when there have been good people in the Scottish Education Department who have not only been receptive to research, but they've been very encouraging of it. A lot depends on the personnel.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, and it just kind of resonate with what you were talking before about the blood on the carpet. Like even for now, like the carpet is empty, people are not fighting there; they absent. So the next question is about what are the top 3 keywords you would use to describe SERA or describe your feelings about SERA have its 50 years anniversary?
That's a difficult one. There are so many possible questions, and I would think that one of them, and it follows on from what we were discussing earlier about making contact, I think dialogue is an important question. Dialogue with other researchers, with people who have got administrative and managerial responsibilities, dialogue with officials in various national organizations. So I would see that as an important word. I would also see questioning as an important word, because doing research is about asking important questions that may well lead to better understanding of what's going on in the educational system. And I think questioning of untested assumptions. We're less good in Scotland than I would like about asking hard questions about the existing system of educational provision. And a term that I would, was perhaps less obvious, but I would like to see, and in a way it ties in with what Gert Bista was saying, I would like to see more intellectual openness.
Intellectual openness.
Yes. Openness to new ideas, new ways of thinking, new research methods, and not being too tied to the traditional conventions of doing educational research. These are the three terms I choose, but there are lots of terms that might be chosen instead.
It's quite interesting to hear how you explain with the dialogue, questioning, and intellectual openness. These three terms, actually, I would say they're connected with each other as well. If there's no dialogue, how could you start to question things? And it's about the questioning that opens up with intellectual debate, and they open up with new opportunities and new ideas, and for more dialogues as well.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right when you say the three terms are connected.
Yes. And the last question for the SERA 50 is, what would you like to see in the future of SERA and the SERA people?
I think it would be good if we had wider representation from different parts of the educational system. For example, I don't think enough research is done on further and higher education. The heavy concentration is on school education. And I think the further and higher education system is in need of scrutiny just as much as the other parts. Also, a sort of neglected area of educational provision is community learning and development. We did actually have a lecture on that last year, but it doesn't feature very strongly on many of the papers. So I would like to see more representation of these relatively neglected areas. But I would also like, and this comes back to something I said earlier, I would like to see more boldness. Not more of the same, as Gert Bista put it, but more boldness, more innovation in thinking about research.
And it's what you were saying, because before we were actually talking about previous interviewees like Bista and Carsten Kankley. They're both talking about like the education, maybe not just main school education, and education also could be museum education, like learning like tea ceremony in Japan, and a lot of things could be seen as education in the museum, in the gallery, in the communities. But I didn't see that much of it in SERA, maybe just because I've not been involved that much. I've only been involved for 2 years. But maybe it's time to imagine what education could be, not just with only a focus on schooling.
Yes, I mean, there was a book written by a colleague at Glasgow University when I was there many years ago called Education and Schooling. And he was trying to make the point that schooling wasn't the whole of education. There was a lot of education, a lot of learning that took place outside the school. So I think that point is a very valid one.
Yeah. So now we're moving to the main questions for mentoring early career researchers. This is the key part that we have for the ECR podcast. Is I always see ECR as a phase that people grow from it. Even though now you are retired, but you must have gone through the ECR phase and gradually come to this phase. It's not like suddenly you get into the field, you're retired. You must have gone through these pathways as ECRs, and maybe also, like you said, you have been supervised students, have been mentoring with younger scholars. So if you could travel back, we have a time traveler, you could travel back to the first few years of yourself as a doctoral researcher, and what would you do differently?
Well, I'm in a slightly awkward position to answer that question because my PhD was not in education.
What was it in?
It was in English literature. And, after I did my PhD, I studied for a master's in education. So there was a sort of intellectual process taking place in moving from one fairly well-defined academic discipline to one that was less well-defined. It was much more open. So that took a bit of intellectual adjustment on my part. But I was very fortunate to get a university post as soon as I finished my master's, having already had a PhD. So I'm not really in the same position as most young educational researchers are now, where the pathway through either a professional doctorate, an Ed.D., or a traditional doctorate, a PhD, is the more usual route. But I suppose what I would say is that potential researchers in education should keep in mind the possibility that there are different routes to academic success. And one of the other things that occurred to me when I read your questions was later on, I took what many people considered at the time was an unwise move in my career. And I suppose the point I'm making is that sometimes you have to take a risk. I was at Glasgow for not quite sure how long, quite a long time, probably 15 plus years. The department, for internal political reasons, which I won't go into, was in decline. The university was not appointing people to fill vacancies. So the size of the department was diminishing. I felt my career was going nowhere. I wasn't being promoted internally. And I thought, I can either stay here for the rest of my career, it's quite a comfortable berth, or I can do something. And I was fortunate in the position I was in. I was able to take a risk that only affected me. And I moved from the university to become Director of Professional Studies at St Andrews College, a college of education. And everybody thought that's a silly move. It was the best move I ever made, in the sense that it gave my career a new challenge, a new stimulus. I was involved in initial teacher education in a way that I wasn't at the university at that time. I had much better contact with what was going on in schools and had a new set of colleagues with different perspectives. And it opened up opportunities that I wouldn't have had if I had stayed at Glasgow. And of course, subsequently, St Andrews College merged with Glasgow. And when that merger took place, I was fortunate enough to become head of educational studies. The other thing is, sometimes you have to be patient. I was in my 50s before I got my first professorship. My career took off very late compared with many people now.
Yeah.
So my advice would be keep your options open, and if you're able to do so and you feel you're not getting the stimulus and the recognition in your current post, be prepared to move. And in my late career, I moved around quite a lot. So, although my background is a bit different, I think there is a lesson for all researchers there. Sometimes you've got to take a risk. It worked out for me. We wouldn't be talking if it hadn't worked out.
But I think there are people like they're just afraid of taking the risk and they couldn't make it. But the thing is, if you're already feeling like uncomfortable in one situation, you just suffer in this. It's probably even worse for your own health. Take the risk, the opportunity to go to a healthy environment, and you may have a better opportunity in the future. Although at this moment it's a risk, but at least you left the toxic environment where you were being left there and couldn't do anything positive.
Yes, and I was in the position of being able to take that risk because it was only me that was going to be affected. For a younger person with, say, a young family, they may come to the conclusion, okay, it's not ideal, but I'm better staying where I am. At least I've got security. Not an easy choice.
Yes, I would say. But it's good to know this, and thank you for sharing this with us. It's very, very valuable. I think also it shows how diverse kind of lived experience, and there's no kind of expectation like you have to be successful, you have to get this before a certain age. It's be patient, be open-minded to the different opportunities. That's very valuable. And so I guess you kind of also answer the second question then.
Yes,
the second question, it's related to like when you go to a doctorate degree, would you go on the same route or go put a different kind of develop a different route for the career?
Yes, there are different ways of having a successful academic career. It's not one model that fits all circumstances. And I think the field of education as a field of study benefits from people who have come via different routes. If we were all going from the same route, I think we would end up exchanging the same ideas and not being sufficiently challenging to each other.
It will be echoing room. You keep talking to each other, but you don't care about what is outside the room. And then why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? So the third question is, when you look back in your days as early career researcher, are there any lessons you have learned and would like to share with emerging researchers today?
Yes, one or 2 points under this heading. I think that from reading a lot of doctoral students' work, one of the things that has jumped out at me is the danger of either over-theorizing or under-theorizing. A good piece of research requires a strong conceptual framework, and there are lots of sources for that. But if the conceptual framework dominates the study to the exclusion of, the empirical data or the interview data, so that what can happen is you have several chapters at the beginning which are conceptually very heavy, and then you jump down to something that seems very basic and nuts and bolts and descriptive. And it's the linking of the theory and the research evidence that you have gathered that is important. Equally, I can think of people who have not done enough theoretical groundwork, and they simply launch straight into a kind of descriptive narrative. So it's getting the balance right between intellectually challenging theory, which demonstrates the work that has gone into the thesis, but also most educational research wants to have implications for practice, to make recommendations, to try to improve provision. So it's that balance, and I think some students find it easier to reach that balance than others. That's one point. I think another thing that I would say, it's quite important to go into the history of your topic. A writer whose writing I admired, although I didn't agree with a lot of his views, been dead for a number of years, G.H. Bentock, used to refer to the parochialism of the present. By that he meant the tendency just to conceive of topics in relation to what is currently fashionable or currently in the news. And he wrote a lot about history of education. And one example that springs to mind in relation to my own work, I've recently written a long piece about the curriculum theorist Lawrence Stenhouse, who wrote a very important book in the 1970s called An Introduction to Curriculum Research and Development. And in the article, I suggest that if the people who developed curriculum for excellence had shown familiarity with the work of Lawrence Stenhouse, they may have come up with a set of better proposals. So understanding the history of the topic is important. One other point under this heading is to do with writing. I suppose because of my background in literature, I take my writing very seriously in terms of its clarity, in terms of its structure, and too much academic writing is, let's be frank, dull, stodgy, and not always immediately comprehensible. And I was fortunate to have opportunities to do quite a lot of journalism when I was doing my work in universities. And I wrote a regular article for the Times Educational Supplement, for example, for 10 years. I wrote for an online journal for about 10 years. And what that did for me was it made me write in a much sharper, clearer style. So that I think it's possible to write a good, heavyweight academic article that is also accessible to most readers. It's not a matter of, trying to be too clever or trying to confuse the reader. You have to convey the message to the reader in a way that makes sense intellectually, but is also comprehensible and preferably well written. I spend quite a lot of time polishing my articles. I like editing. I like cutting things out. I often cut out whole paragraphs and say, that's not saying anything new, it's just repeating. Or that phrase is not really very appropriate here. Or that word is not quite the right word. And I spend time thinking, what is the right word? So the quality of the writing, I think, is important.
And what you have said just recalls me, reminded me of the time when I was finding it quite difficult with the balance of the theory and empirical evidence and how to write it accessibly for the readers. I actually asked Mark, how could I do it? And one of the best advice I have got and act up on was reading some of the very well written theses. If you are doing with the PhD route, read the very well written thesis that your supervisors have supervised or they have examined, so you get to know how has your peers done this, and that's very important. And another thing I quite like as early career researchers is sometimes I find it so difficult to read all the long kind of articles. I would go for kind of these short pieces, like you said, you write for the journalism, and you could also nowadays could even check their videos like this video to see what it means. The kind of it's the multiple inputs to absorb like a sponge to know what had been done instead of I have to be clever by shutting yourself in a room, open up to see like what have been done and what you are adding up on to the conversation. Yeah.
Yes. I've been fortunate in that I've had some very good PhD students, some of whom have gone on to have very distinguished academic careers. One that springs to mind was when I was at Glasgow, I supervised a man called Leon Tickley, who was from South Africa originally, and he was an absolute delight to supervise because he more or less shaped his own research program. My task was to read the successive drafts he produced. And unusually, still very unusual, his thesis was accepted without the need for any amendments at all. He has gone on to be an academic at Birmingham. He's now a professor at Bristol. And I've had other very good students who have been a delight to supervise. And I like a bit of resistance from students in the sense that I like them sometimes to say, well, that's your advice, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stick to what I plan to do. I can think of a student from Taiwan who was exactly like that. And he became a dean in a university in Taiwan. So again, very bright guy. So I mean, that's one of the delights of being an academic. You work with some very brilliant young people.
Yeah, and I think that that's another thing, because you're talking about you have students from Taiwan, and I guess their first language is not English. Like, do you feel like it's different when you're supervising a student coming from a very different mother tongue compared to English? Like, what would you do? Kind of like, do you do something additional, like to support them to write in a second language?
Yes, in that particular student, when he arrived, his English was not great, but he worked hard at it. He was also, it took him time to adjust to the culture. It's very different. He came from a very deferential culture. I remember, in fact, when he first arrived, he was introduced to the professor, and he asked the professor, "What do I call you, sir? Do I call you Your Excellency or Your Highness?" And within less than a year, he called the professor by his first name. So he adjusted very well. And but I mean, his English came on very, very quickly because he was a bright man, and his field was philosophy of education. So language was absolutely critical to his study. But yes, and universities, I think, are better at providing support for students from other countries now, partly because they're so keen to recruit many of them.
Yeah, like if you recruit them, better prepare them better to kind of like for your reputation, for their success.
Yes, I mean, it's not enough simply to accept their fees. You have to provide the right kind of support so that they will be successful.
I think so. I couldn't say too much about the fees. Of course, I want the fees to be lower down as international student. I could see a lot of this, how it is putting more kind of like constraints, more hurdles for people. But I also see the difficulty as international students is to realize this is not just a language change, it's also a cultural change, and how you could have your supervisors as a genuine reader, like you said, reading the drafts and having discussion with you, even having debates with you to see how your ideas, how your thesis shape. And this, I would say, is very different from the way I was growing up. So the way I was growing up, I was always told to respect the teachers, to follow the teacher's advice, and do not challenge the authority. You should respect the teachers and continue what the teachers have done. So it's very different. It's important to bear this in mind if you come from a different culture than the Scottish culture. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not an easy thing to adjust to.
I know.
You know, I think a lot of students will find it unsettling if they're encouraged to be critical and ask challenging questions and express their own views rather than simply repeat the views of so-called experts.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the next one is about, could you recall someone who have influenced you into the field of educational research?
Well, there are quite a lot of people who have influenced me. I would certainly include Lawrence Stenhouse, whom I mentioned earlier, as one example. The work on of Stephen Ball in England on policy study. Yes, his work in the 1990s certainly influenced me. But I think probably the strongest influence in the Scottish context has been the work of Andrew Macpherson of the Centre for Educational Sociology at Edinburgh University. Andrew had to retire young for health reasons, but his unit produced a lot of very impressive research. And the book that he co-wrote with Charles Rabb, called Governing Education, which was published in 1988 and won the Education Book of the Year that year. I mean, that's a magnificent piece of work, and I still have occasion to refer to it quite often. So I would say Andrew Macpherson would be one of the key people for me.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up question about this? Because I'm also doing kind of like an initiative. I call it Mapping Inspirational Women. So I wanted to borrow your wisdom that in your field, or what you have known in field of educational research, what are the women scholars that have influenced you or have kind of like you think their work are very impressive?
Well, I can think of one from a long time ago. A woman called Margaret Macmillan, who did work on early years and preschool education. She was Scottish. She did, although she was born in America, but she was educated in Scotland, and she moved to England partly for political reasons. She was quite radical in her politics. She did marvelous work in Bradford and in London, and she wrote extensively about the nurture of early years children. She secured a national and international reputation. Sadly, she wasn't given much recognition in Scotland. She was given more recognition in England and abroad. She was made a Companion of Honour, which is a very high distinction. But there was strong intellectual grounding in her practical work. She travelled in Europe, and I wrote an article about her published in Scottish Educational Review. But there are lots of current female academics whose work I admire. I mean, I admire the work of Aileen Kennedy, for example, who's now at Glasgow. Jenny Osga, who was at Edinburgh and is now at Oxford. There are lots of good academics around. So these are the names that spring to mind.
First come to your mind.
Yes. Margaret Arnott at University of the West of Scotland, I like her work too, because she writes about the sort of politics of education, the changing political context in which policy decisions are made.
Thank you for all of this. I'll search them later and add it upon to the Mapping Inspirational Women kind of word matter I've produced, because I always find it so difficult, especially for me coming from another country and coming here, and I already have my field. I know my field quite well, but I didn't know the overview of like educational research and what are the women scholars they have contributed to it. Really appreciate that. And then the next question is, nowadays, when you are writing and editing, which is one of your favorite things, what do you think is a good habit that keep yourself going? good habit of writing and editing?
Yes, I used to be very good at setting myself a target of, maybe 500 words in a morning, because I tend to write in the morning. And occasionally I managed quite a bit more than that. As I've got older, I find my ability to concentrate is not as strong as it used to be. So I have a technique that some researchers might find useful. If I'm writing and I see where the text is going, and I can point ahead to the things I want to discuss in the next section, say, instead of bashing on and getting it all down as quickly as possible, I just make notes about where I'm going and then stop. And the reason I do that is that when you restart, you're not restarting from a blank page. Having finished the previous section, you've got your starter words already before you, and it's much easier to resume writing when you see where you're going. So that's one tip that I found useful, because sometimes you do a bit of work and you think, well, that's quite good. I'll stop there and give myself a little treat, a cup of tea, a chocolate biscuit. But then when you go back, you don't start up. Yes, where we're going, yes. So that's one thing I have found useful.
So it's about not ending that section, like ending that section and writing some notes about which is the direction you are going, and then go for a treat.
Yes, because you might lose the ideas between, if you just end the section, the ideas that you're having as you're writing, they may not be there when you return, particularly if you're an older person.
No, honestly, it happens to me as well. And it's just, probably sometimes it's your memory could only handle with these many things. So it's good to write some down notes to remind yourself which is the direction you want to go, what are the sentences you want to put down. But you don't have to write the whole thing down, but just have a tip for yourself to.
That's right. Yes.
That's really good. That's
may not work for everyone. Sorry?
That's very a practical advice to do.
It may not work for everybody, but it certainly works for me.
And the next question is about reading. So early career researchers, I've defined what the important part of is. First is editorial writing, E for editorial writing, C for conversations with scholars, and R for reading club. So for the reading club, I always ask this question and try to get ideas from you, like, what have you been reading recently that you find thought-provoking or eye-opening, and you think it is okay to share with us?
Right. I'm working on an article at the moment which may or may not ever see the light of day, but I have found the ideas of an American political theorist called Murray Edelman, who was writing in the 80s and 90s, and he was very prescient about the direction of education. And I've been looking at, I mean, he's not a writer about education, or to any extent, but his ideas about policy and how increasingly politicians are less concerned about the substance of policy than with the presentation of policy. He talks about policy as spectacle. It's about creating a media event to promote a policy, but they're less interested in whether the policy actually works. It's a promotional thing.
It's just need to have the policy, but doesn't care what the policy say.
Yes, and quite often by the time the policy has shown itself perhaps to be less than effective, they will have moved on. They will have perhaps moved to another position in government, or an election will have taken place and they are no longer in government, so they don't have to live with the consequences. So Murray Edelman's ideas are sort of floating around in my head at the moment. But I also read very widely, and because of my literature background, I still read a lot of fiction, and I've started the latest book by a very distinguished Scottish writer called Andrew O'Hagan, and the book is called Caledonian Road. It's not about education, but it's about the state of society.
Mm.
A very sort of sharp perspective on the various power networks within society. And an additional attraction is that he has a celebrity academic who is presented in a very unflattering light. I began to think of people I know when I was reading that. But it's a challenging read. It's over 600 pages, but it's beautifully written and very thought-provoking. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend that an early career researcher in education reads it, because they will have more immediately relevant things to read. I get ideas from lots of sources, quite often from good fiction.
Yeah, but I think even for early career researchers, like at my stage, sometimes I quite enjoy reading something not directly relevant to my field. It's not about like I have to learn something from it, but I want to have a mental break. But that's not a break like I just look at the videos. I want to change. I kind of like see how they tell the story. Like how come this is 600 pages and I still read it every day, or like want to come back to it. So sometimes I find that fictional writing is really something I'm quite interested in, but I'm more is slightly interested in stream of consciousness. So less than a story, but see how people can write down what they have in mind and have the readers going with the flow of their consciousness. Like that's amazing, the way how they tell their ideas.
And good fiction enhances your understanding of human nature and the human condition.
I would say so.
Yeah. But these are just a couple of examples of current reading.
Yeah. And the last mentoring question is, when you experience lows in your work, what do you do to remotivate yourself?
I step back. I do something quite different. I
make vegetable soups. Make vegetable soups.
Oh, well, yes, make vegetable soup. That's very therapeutic. I've also started making my own bread too, which is very therapeutic. But I take exercise, I walk, and I'm a keen swimmer. I swim several times a week. And as you're swimming up and down, the worries that you have when you're at your computer just they float away. And once you've had a break like that, you can come back refreshed.
It's about not let the work being overwhelming or around you. Try to do something else that you feel refreshing. Either it's swimming, or it's walking, or it's making bread. It's important to still have a life.
Yes, I mean, apart from serious literary fiction, I also read quite a lot of crime fiction. And I find crime fiction is very therapeutic too, for all the wrong reasons.
It's different sides of water Humes, now you know. And the last section of the ECR is that we noticed it'd be quite interesting to see how we could cross time and space to have conversations with people who have been interviewed by us and who people going to be interviewed by us. So the first question we had was conversations of scholars from Hospista. We want to ask future interviewees, I would like to ask them their views on the state of educational research, the state of educational scholarship.
Yes, I thought that was and he went on to give his own answer to it.
Yeah, he gave you the answer.
Essentially, it wasn't in as healthy a state as he would like it to be.
Yeah.
He thought it was too many people doing much the same thing, not sufficiently open to new ideas. So I think, that's a good provocation to offer. And I think we all of us involved in educational research need to reflect on it. I think he's probably right. And it ties in with what I said earlier about the importance of being open to new ideas and new approaches. And there are implications for research methodology as well. You know, there has been a tendency to be more prescriptive about approved research methods. My own research methods have always been pretty eclectic. They, you know, they are not narrowly defined or methodologically pure. I draw on whatever I think is going to cast light on the topic that I'm looking at. So that was an interesting comment, yes.
And do you want to go to the next one, or you have a little bit more to say? Your view on the state of educational research, the state of educational scholarship.
No, I'll go to the next one because I will come back.
Next one.
I have another comment to make after I've referred to the two comments that you alerted me to. I don't think education is an independent academic discipline. I think it's a field of study which draws on a wide range of disciplines. It used to be the case that around about the 1960s, 70s, that education was defined as a field of study that drew on history, philosophy, and psychology.
That's what my review in the beginning. I started with this. Of course, later on I changed the style, but these are the exact three disciplines I refer to.
Yes, and that, I mean, students in teacher training courses were introduced to that view. The number of disciplines, of course, increased. You know, quite a lot of management and leadership stuff came in. Then there was school effectiveness and school improvement, which was seen as central. And of course, increasingly technology became important. So I would say there isn't a definitive list of disciplines that support the field of education. It's changing all the time, and there will be new ones coming down the road. So I think you have to be open-minded about what can contribute to educational understanding. It means that the field is untidy, it's messy, because it spills over in so many directions. But I think that just goes with the territory.
It's your response to Carsten Kankley's question: is education studies an independent academic discipline or field of research? So you are more inclined to say it is a field of research.
Yes. Although I would be very willing to have an interesting conversation with him about
it.
Yes. And the third question is,
what do you find most interesting about the future of educational research?
Exciting and also potentially alarming. I think artificial intelligence. We don't really know where artificial intelligence is going to take us. And I think it has the potential to affect not just the learning of individuals, but the role of institutions like schools and universities. And I mean, I'm certainly not an expert in technology, but I did my own little experiment with these, what's it called?
ChatGPT?
Sorry?
ChatGPT, is it?
Yes, it's not that one, but I did something with something similar. And I asked a couple of questions about educational policy making. And I was astonished at what came up in response. I mean, and it was correct. It was knowledgeable. It was well written. And I thought, well, if it can do that to a simple question, you know, it's going to transform the world in some way. But we know that it has all sorts of risks too. It's open to abuse and misuse. So I think it's exciting, but the excitement is you know, a bit double-edged. It will have benefits, but it will have a downside too. And that will be for much younger people than me to explore. Yes, the other thing I wanted to say was I thought you might want to ask me for a question like those. And my question is about something we haven't really touched on, but it's got to do with the way universities are changing.
Yeah.
The role of universities. And my question is there a risk to academic freedom in the corporate culture of universities? If there is, that risk will affect educational studies as well as all sorts of other disciplines. My reading is that the corporate culture of universities, the borrowing of business models and the creation of large bureaucracies tends to push academics in the direction of narrowness and conformity. The opportunity to go against the grain and be challenging becomes more difficult. So, and there is a debate about where academic freedom is going, and some academics have run into serious difficulty by saying and writing things that the university disapproves of. And I think that's something that all academics ought to be thinking about and responding to. I find that a bit disturbing, that academic freedom is under threat. It's under threat not just from university culture, but from social media, the decline of the press, and
also in the corporate culture of universities, I would say, because that's where most of academics are based in. Like when the university no longer see academics as academics, but as their employees to increase the size of the corporate business, there will be something happening. Quite alarming, yeah.
Yes, and I mean, I think there has been a shift in power in universities, in that the people who carry most weight are administrators and bureaucrats. The frontline academic staff who do the teaching and the research are, in some senses, they have become second-class citizens. They're expected to conform to the expectations of the bureaucrats and the senior managers. I would like to see more vigorous resistance to that trend. It's difficult. It's not easy.
I would say so. Not easy. It is something that we definitely have to think more about it, especially for people like me. Am I going to work for that and to go with this? That's something I think it's quite critical age at me. For me at this stage, just finished my PhD, going to start postdoc, going to consider whether I step into academia or decided to go a different pathway.
Yes, I think it's harder now for younger researchers than it was when I got my first university appointment. I feel very fortunate to have been employed at the time I was. I think I would find some situations in universities quite uncomfortable, and I suspect I might get into a spot of bother. I suspect I might say things that, don't meet with managerial approval.
Yeah. Thank you so much for today. I really appreciate all this, and I'll put it on the SERA ECR YouTube channel, and this will also be played on the SERA 50 anniversary. We have an event in University of Glasgow, and thank you so much for your time, Walter.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your very interesting questions.
Glad you liked them.
Okay, all the best.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye.